Welcome. If you've ever felt that debates between science and religion lead nowhere, that morality seems to have faded, or that as a society we're drifting further away from finding true meaning in life, this space has been created with you in mind. Here, we offer you a different perspective. What if there were an ethics based on observable facts, accessible to any human being, regardless of their religion, culture, or philosophical stance? And what if that common ground was already among us, simply waiting to be recognized? We are guided by a powerful premise. The natural order imposes understandable conditions on us, which we can know, respect, and from which it is possible to build a moral religion. A universal ethics that is not born from fear or dogma, but from love, empathy, and cooperation. An ethics that is simple, but not simplistic, profound, yet within everyone's reach, scientific, yet with spirit. If we could find an ethics grounded in observable aspects, accessible to every inhabitant of the planet, the possibility would arise to put an end to the debates between believers and atheists, or between the religious and the scientific, establishing a clear link between the social sciences and moral religion. The prevailing moral crisis requires, for its solution, a description of human behavior that helps every individual to find meaning in life and guides them back towards the ethics imposed by the natural order. Contemporary Christianity, or at least the version perceived by the average person, far from promoting such an aim, allows for the interpretation of biblical prophecies and visions as if they came from a magical world in which the laws of nature have little or no relevance. In the same way that what Christ said to mankind was gradually replaced by what men say about Christ, the prophecy he established was relegated to a secondary place in favor of the book of Revelation, attributed to John the Evangelist. Hence, it should not be forgotten that the original prophecy proposes a final judgment or a description of human behavior that will not require later revision and that effectively serves to guide every human being towards adapting to the natural order as the price that this order imposes on us and which we must pay for our survival. Whereas pagan religions are based on the belief that a god or several gods intervene in human affairs, rewarding or punishing according to one's adherence to that god or gods, moral religion is based on the belief that everything that happens to a human being depends mainly on their ethical behavior, with the one God having established the rules of the game to which one must adapt. The extreme case is the one in which it is assumed that the Christian innovation involved changing the recipient of prayers and offerings. Thus, while pagans directed them towards false gods, the Christian would address them to the true God. But the attitude of the one making the offering would essentially remain the same. Then, it is interpreted that Christ tried to establish a kind of personality cult, similar to those set up by some totalitarian leaders during the 20th century. The role that the religious innovator must fulfill is to act as a kind of feedback loop, since they must observe the essence of natural laws or God's laws, and then suggest behavior in accordance with those laws, seeking to reduce the gap between the response given by human beings and the apparent goal set by the natural order. Such natural laws have an objective existence, as they do not depend on the preferences, beliefs, or denials that may arise regarding them. The Book of Revelation should not be associated with astronomical phenomena, as is generally assumed, but rather with social and moral phenomena. Thus, the falling of stars or similar symbols should be regarded as human catastrophes brought about by human beings themselves. If there were any intervention from God, it would be aimed at preventing such evils, not at punishments to increase the suffering that already exists. The Bible is essentially a book about morality, whereas pagan religions assume that God or the gods accept human behaviors in the sense that they will respond to our requests and needs as a result of certain rituals. Moral religion, on the other hand, presupposes the existence of a God who expects a certain moral conduct from each human being, and upon this conduct depends the success or failure of our lives. The initial prophecy regarding the second coming of Christ comes from Christ himself. In his first coming, it is clear that his teachings are aimed at preventing human suffering, which is mainly caused by the moral failings of members of society. That is why the end of times does not mean the destruction of humanity or anything of the sort, but rather the end of an era of suffering to give way to a much better stage, a stage symbolized by the expression in the book of Revelation. I saw no weeping, nor outcry, nor pain. Moral religion could be included within the general framework of the cultural adaptation of human beings to the natural order. Human suffering can be considered as a maladaptation to that order, while happiness will be associated with full adaptation. According to the current scientific view of the universe, everything that exists, including intelligent life, is governed by unchanging natural laws, considering that a natural law is the link between stimulus and response or between cause and effect. We know the set of such laws as the natural order. If everything is governed by unchanging natural laws, certain interventions by God, such as miracles, would not be necessary. The mistake pointed out in this case is that most religious people, in many circumstances, ask God to interrupt or change these laws, which is the opposite of trying to adapt to them. Hence, identifying the Creator God with the natural order turns out to be a rather simple and effective starting point. When considering the existence of a universe governed by unchanging natural laws, the possibility arises of finding a religion based on evidence rather than a religion based on beliefs. Moreover, natural laws offer the possibility of being the only objective link possible, common to all human beings, providing the potential for a future and possible union between religions and between experimental science and moral religion. This form of religion is already known as natural religion or deism. An additional simplification arises when taking into account the Stoic principle of focusing mainly on what is accessible to our decisions, leaving somewhat aside what does not depend on them. Let us remember that it is the human being who must change, not the God we imagine. Hence Anthony de Mello's suggestion, miracle does not mean that God changes according to human wishes, but that people change according to God's wishes. While the biblical religions concern themselves with human actions, suggesting an implicit adaptation to the natural order, something similar happens in the social sciences. That is why the convergence between moral religion and social science is possible, desirable, and inevitable. For this, we have the possibility offered by the concept of characteristic attitude, which comes from social psychology. The biologist Julian Huxley rightly pointed out that a future universal religion would, in some way, be associated with social psychology. The natural ethics that arises from social psychology, or the psychology of attitudes, must be made compatible with the two basic tendencies in individual behavior, that is, towards cooperation and towards competition, about which we are predisposed to follow, often with a preference for one over the other. Humans also display a characteristic attitude or response by which we react in the same way in similar circumstances. If this were not the case, it would be impossible to get to know other people, let alone predict possible behaviors. This response, which is more or less constant during a stage of our lives, is, however, subject to change. The possibility of ethical improvement precisely involves a shift from a competitive or even indifferent attitude towards one of cooperation. This typical response, which forms the basis of our personality, can be defined as follows, at least symbolically. The response equals the characteristic attitude multiplied by the stimulus, or alternatively, the characteristic attitude equals the response divided by the stimulus. Both the response and the stimulus are considered from both an emotional and a cognitive point of view, which have little to do with the stimulus-response relationships that appear in many psychological studies associated with our senses. The characteristic attitude of every individual includes both emotional and cognitive components. For the former, we can consider the possible responses to an accident that occurs in a public place. If someone is injured, we might share in some of that suffering, or we might be glad about it, or simply not care because what happens to others matters little to us, or we might be indifferent to everything that happens to others, since we are even indifferent to what happens to ourselves. Notice that we have considered all possible responses to a given event. Such responses vary between different people, both qualitatively and quantitatively, that is, in the intensity with which we might respond with sorrow or joy to the event observed. From this, we can identify the full basic emotional components: love, the attitude by which we share in the sorrows and joys of others; hatred, the attitude by which another's joy brings us sadness and another's sadness brings us our own joy; selfishness, the attitude by which we are only interested in what happens to us; indifference, the attitude by which we are not interested in anyone, not even ourselves. With regard to the cognitive components, we can consider the associative or trial and error method, in which we must adopt a reference point in order to then make a comparison to interpret any new knowledge. Here too we find four basic components: reality as a reference, what one thinks oneself, what another person thinks, and what the majority thinks. Both the characteristic attitude and its emotional and cognitive components form the foundations from which a new point of view is established, allowing us to draw reliable conclusions about various questions concerning human beings and society. Erwin Schrödinger wrote, "The point is not so much to see what no one has yet seen, but to think what no one has yet thought about what everyone sees." The perspective the Bible gives us on the history of humanity is linked to a struggle between good and evil. In principle, it can be said that good is what pleases us and brings us happiness, while evil is what is unwanted and brings us unhappiness. Since the Bible is essentially an ethical book, it is justified to associate both good and evil with the emotional components of characteristic attitudes according to the following scheme. Good is love. Evil is hatred, selfishness, and indifference. For the definitive triumph of good over evil, we can put forward the following suggestion. Try to share in the joys and sorrows of others as if they were your own. It should be noted that this natural and objective ethic involves choosing one of the emotional components of our characteristic attitude while trying as much as possible to avoid the others. This suggestion essentially coincides with Christ's commandment, "Love your neighbor as yourself." Love, defined in this way, is nothing other than emotional empathy, which has been substantiated by neuroscience with the discovery of mirror neurons. Emotional empathy can be considered the main natural process that enables our survival, since by adopting the attitude of love, we are predisposed to help others and not harm them, while at the same time each of us benefits ourselves. The simplicity of an ethical suggestion should be linked to the idea that the natural order itself must allow the basic knowledge necessary to ensure our survival as a species to be accessible to every human being, regardless of their intellect or intelligence. It is appropriate to mention the definition of love given by Baruch Spinoza, who wrote on the subject. He who imagines that the object of his love is affected by joy or sorrow will also be affected by joy or sorrow, and each of these emotions will be greater or lesser in the lover, depending on whether it is greater or lesser in the beloved. He also defines hatred. He who imagines that the object of his hatred is affected by sorrow will rejoice. If, on the contrary, he imagines it affected by joy, he will be saddened. And each of these emotions will be greater or lesser, depending on whether the opposite emotion is greater or lesser in the object of his hatred. From the book Ethics. There are those who claim that, the Christian commandment urges us to love everyone equally, both the righteous and sinners, even criminals. By doing so, we would, in a way, be promoting evil and going against the purpose set out by the Bible. On the contrary, if we consider that love for one's neighbor is a favorable disposition to share the sorrows and joys of others as if they were our own, this will happen naturally as long as others allow it to occur. Thus, in the case of a criminal, it is natural for them to provoke a certain rejection, which prevents their sorrows and joys from being shared by others. Every ethical system must describe both how to do good and how to reject evil. That is why we must also describe the remaining emotional components. Thus, selfishness is the attitude that does not produce good in others, although neither does it produce harm. We could say that it is an ethically neutral attitude, insufficient for the triumph of good over evil. Hatred is the attitude that favors evil, since the person who harbors it feels joy when something bad happens to the person they hate, sometimes expressing this joy through mockery. When the hated person achieves some success, the one who hates will feel displeasure or sorrow, which implies envy. Indifference is the attitude by which an individual is unconcerned about others and also about themselves. The selfish person, as mentioned, is unconcerned about others, but is interested in themselves and their close ones, which is how they differ from the indifferent person. Hence the importance of distinguishing between them. Wolfgang Goethe wrote, "Negligence and dissension cause more harm in the world than hatred and wickedness." Pure cases in which one of the basic attitudes completely predominates generally do not exist in human beings, since our characteristic attitude is made up of all of them, albeit in different proportions. As emotions are gradually controlled by reasoning, it is possible to adjust these proportions towards a distinctly cooperative attitude, and it is in this that individual ethical improvement lies. By highlighting the existence of the emotional components of our characteristic attitude and deriving from them a natural and objective ethics, the arguments put forward by proponents of moral relativism are rendered ineffective, since in every era and every place, love has produced good, while hatred, selfishness, and indifference have denied it, favoring the predominance of evil. It can be said that a society is undergoing a moral crisis when, in a widespread manner, the biblical commandments are not observed, both by atheists and believers alike. Just as not knowing how to read is equivalent to never reading anything, so too is failing to observe the commandments as a believer.